Janus Razor by Jim Lee. Part 5. Resistance. Give and take. Has all we've learned been wrong? Look around at what we've been given. Maybe we've taken too long. Resistance, shouts the man on the right. Can't solve the problem overnight. Resistance, liberal opposition, crying violation. Stop the madness. Resistance, through the din, one voice we should hear. Resistance, listen to the call of the wild. There's no easy solution. The price is high and it's time to pay. Turn of the century vision, focused on a better way. Resistance, shouts the man on the right. Can't solve the problem overnight. Resistance, liberal opposition crying violation. Stop the madness. Resistance, through the din, one voice we should hear. Resistance, listen to the call of the wild. Queensryche, Resistance. Now, look, before I go any further here, before I say anything else, there's something I need to address. I know there's been a fair amount of concern on the part of certain people regarding the things I've been saying on this channel, specifically whether certain things are appropriate for me to say. I imagine that some folks would like me to take some things back, to edit out a phrase here, or censor certain things there. They would like, perhaps, to live in a world that is homogenized and pasteurized for their protection, to shut out voices that say things that ruffle their feathers, things that are unpleasant. The problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that the world where we could afford to do such things is gone. The stakes are just too damn high. The reason our founding fathers codified the protection of our freedom to speak in the Constitution was that they foresaw the possibility of a day where we would need to say unpleasant things to awaken our countrymen to an impending destruction. A day where we would need to speak inconvenient truths that would upset people. Popular speech needs no protection. Pleasant speech needs no protection. But our forebears understood that those who upset the status quo are going to require protection under the law. Now, maybe you think that in the grand scheme of things, the things that I say on this channel don't amount to a hill of beans, that I'm just pointlessly flapping my gums over here, and you are entitled to that opinion. But I've been around long enough to have seen enough to know better. Censorship always starts off with easy targets, with the low-hanging fruit of ideas commonly held as abhorrent, because almost no one will defend such things. But then comes the restriction of revolutionary or seditious speech, because these violations of liberty are seen, by many who should know better, as sensible precautions, usually under extenuating circumstances. And before you know it, ladies and gentlemen, we've slid all the way down that slippery slope, and jackbooted thugs patrol the streets, eager to disappear any who dare to speak in a manner which is critical of the regime. Ken Sharkey had been chafing under the ominously worded suggestions that the officer who led the small detachment of troops that had set up office in the building had been making for the past several weeks. Most of these suggestions had been regarding the things personnel were allowed to say on air. In the months since Razorfall, KOA had continued to try to report any fragment of news they could get their hands on, and these had, at first, included eyewitness accounts of troop movements as the U.S. Army continued to send men and equipment west over the Rockies. The result was that a ripple of hope spread through the people, and denizens of Denver and the surrounding areas started to congregate at the roadsides of the main traffic arteries used for these movements. Government, which until recently had seemed ubiquitous in the lives of Americans, had gone silent after Razorfall. This seemingly endless parade of slow-moving military might was the first sign that government had not simply dissolved in the wake of the cataclysm, and even folks who had never considered themselves particularly patriotic found themselves joining the throngs cheering along the route. Placards were held up by enthusiastic women with images of a reimagined Uncle Sam, sleeves torn away to reveal bulging biceps, using feet clad in huge green boots to kick the posteriors of large, yowling yellow tomcats. People were doing more than cheering on a military effort. They were cheering on what they believed was the first sign of the return of the civilization they had lost. Then, the flow of machinery thinned to a trickle and then stopped entirely. The people who had survived the first month or so of chaos huddled in anticipation. They expected to hear news that the enemy had been soundly defeated and that the long process of rebuilding what they had lost could finally begin. Visions of trucks rolling through the cities, festooned with Army or Red Cross logos and laden with supplies, filled their heads as they hung on every word that came from KOA. They gathered around every working radio, waiting to hear the glad tidings. How they imagined they would be able to look at each other after the things they had done to their neighbors and the people they had become in order to survive was temporarily forgotten. In retrospect, such hubris was hardly surprising. Americans had come to believe they led a charmed existence, that they could, whenever they united and applied their true strength, that is, when moral ambiguity was removed and they found the collective political will to actually apply all the force at their disposal, win any contest, hands down. Even the atrocity which had been visited upon America in 2001 was considered a coward's victory, the equivalent of punching a prizefighter not when he is in the ring and ready to defend himself, but when he is seated with his family for dinner in a public restaurant. They did not believe any other outcome to a premeditated engagement but victory was possible, because no account in living memory gave them cause to imagine such an outcome. Even when the silence from the western slope outside of Rifle, Colorado, stretched from days to weeks, success was always a foregone conclusion. So much the greater, then, was the despair which fell when the first surviving deserter came crawling back over the front range and the public learned of the defeat by the strange off-worlders. This story was discovered and broadcast by the diminished news crew at KOA, who had begun referring to themselves as the Voice of America, when a bedraggled-looking man in olive drab was escorted in by what now passed for the station's security personnel. He claimed to have at least a partial eyewitness account of the confrontation between the Army and the aliens. Ken Sharkey had been in the booth. The station had been playing a pre-recorded interview with a retired tactician, which was representative of the kind of content they were using to fill the time as they waited for real news. Curiously, many people found this kind of armchair quarterbacking oddly comforting. Older broadcasts from this very station, reporting in the long ago, had been eerily similar, though the potential weaknesses in offense or defense being discussed in those days had more to do with angling for an NFL playoff spot than the fate of humanity. Ken had ushered the man into the booth and questioned him for several minutes. Tony Ramirez stood outside the cramped booth, wishing he had learned how to read lips. With Mark having bugged out a few weeks ago, Tony was the last of those who had made the trip west to set up the relay and record footage of the Razor itself, who still manned KOA's beacon of truth. He was one of the few people who had never quite been able to muster enough faith in what might be left of Uncle Sam to believe they could defeat what Vince had described to them. Vince had never been a genius, but he knew his job well enough, and it had carried him to many dangerous places. He had worked on Ken's crew complement when Ken had done his stint as an embedded reporter in the Gulf. Living through times like that sizzled your nerve endings a bit, they said. Things that would have startled you before just couldn't provoke the same response. Once you've been tumbled out of your bunk by the tail end of a shock wave from an errant artillery shell, you stop grousing over covering a story about some loser barricaded inside a 7-Eleven. So maybe Vince had been no Einstein, but he had seen things. Tony didn't think he would have scared easily. And as he stared through the hazy glass of the booth and watched the color draining out of Ken's face, Tony knew something else. Something he had been trying to avoid looking at directly in his mind's eye. In his heart, Tony knew that he was the one who was supposed to have died that day. He and Vince had both been capable of handling the gear, which was being left behind at the Razor site with Chuck, so they settled the choice of who would stay behind the usual way. When it was 3 or more of them, they drew straws, but when it was 2, they flipped a coin. Tony had been the one with the quarter, and as it tumbled through the air, he had been seized by a terrible feeling of dread. This creepy mirror had eaten Jackie and then Kurt right in front of them. Who was to say it would stay still? He had a clear image in his mind, as the coin glinted in the failing sunlight, of the mind-bending reflective wall gliding slowly toward him while his back was turned, and gulping him in before he could make a single sound. Gone to wherever the others had gone, or maybe to nowhere, just non-existence. The idea of it towering above them, like Damocles' sword, was maddening. He simply couldn't stay there any longer. He had snatched the coin out of the air and slapped it down between his hands and waited for Vince to call it. Head, Vince had said. It was what he always said. He had a little joke he liked to tell when they used to go out to the bar after work. Look, he'd say, there's only one, right? One coin, one head, one tail. So why should I use the plural unless you're flipping multiple coins? Besides, he would grin at any girls present at this point, if you give me the choice between head and tail, I'm always going to choose head. I'm just a laid-back kind of guy. Tony had seen him perform this little routine numerous times, and Vince always laughed raucously. And more than once, he had left at the end of the night with a girl who had responded with her own smirking smile. Tony had lifted his hand and peered beneath to see the profile of George Washington staring back at him with a somber sideways glance. Before Vince could see it, Tony had scooped it up and rammed it back into his pocket. Sorry, no head for you today, Vince. But maybe if you ask nice, Chuck'll cuddle up with you when it gets cold tonight. He had painted what he thought was a convincing winner's smile on his face. Vince had stared at the hand in the pocket for a moment, looking as though he meant to question the outcome, and then his features had shifted into a grin. No thanks, he had said with a laugh. I'm saving all my lovin' for your sister when I get back. He had laughed, and just like that, the matter had been dropped. Tony rode away, and Vince had taken his place. And the following evening, Vince had been killed by some kind of space alien robot cats or something. Killed instead of him. Tony had jumped at shadows every day since. His sleep had been restless, interrupted by nightmares, dreams where he would hear some horrible, liquid slithering sound behind him. Each time, his mouth was locked shut, frozen in terror, as he could not stop his treacherous feet from turning him around to see what made the sound. And there, each time, inches from his face, the ghastly immensity of the razor shimmered, seeming to stretch away to infinity in all directions except the stony ground below. And in the mirror's cold surface, rather than his own reflection, stood Vince's pale, decapitated body, holding its own head in its lifeless gray hands. And then the eyes would snap open, and the severed head would whisper, I knew you lied to me, Tony. I knew it was head all along. And Tony would wake to the sound of his own terrified screams. He had taken to sleeping in a disabled car so the other people in his sister's apartment building wouldn't bang on the walls telling him to, for Christ's sake, shut up! but he had pulled the rearview mirror off and thrown it over the embankment on the side of the street which overlooked the drop to the east. He had begun avoiding all mirrors, secretly afraid that in one of them Vince's mangled image would be staring back at him with those lifeless gray eyes and that accusing whisper. Ken was tapping on the booth's grimy window. "Earth to Tony," the muffled voice came through. When he saw that he finally had Tony's attention, Ken gave him the little hand signal that meant "let's get started," pointed to the army kid, and held up 2 fingers, indicating he had mic'd the kid up on feed 2. From the dazed look on his face, Ken guessed Tony was already figuring out the same thing he had just discovered. There would be no joy in Mudville tonight. A kid was all he was, really, Ken thought. Kids were capable of guile, of course, but enough of what this one had said had rung true to convince Ken that he was what he claimed to be, the survivor of a massacre. He had seen the look in the eyes of PTSD guys in the Gulf. He didn't believe that was a look you could ever fake to someone who had seen the real thing. Long years before, they had called the same condition shell shock. Ken thought this was a whole lot more accurate assessment of the condition. The first time he had heard the term, back when he had started his first tour as an embedded reporter, some Army medic had told him they changed the description, both because it wasn't always artillery shells that caused it, and because there were a host of excessive stimuli which could cause it, so this was more precise. Ken had laughingly told the medic he thought it was a reference to turtles, because the guys it happened to looked to him like turtles that had been startled back into their shells, who, henceforth, didn't want to come out. The medic had given Ken one of those looks, the kind that, if looks could kill, would have vaporized Ken into a greasy smear. "You think it's funny?" the medic had roared. He had then pulled a wicked-looking knife from his belt and held it up to one of Ken's crew, with the insanely keen edge quivering a hair's breadth from the cameraman's throat, as the medic held the man by the collar. "This blade is sharp," he stated flatly. "I could let this guy's guts out onto his shoes before he could even scream." He released the cameraman and pointed out of the canopy under which they stood. He pointed to each of the other crewmen with laser-like precision. "I could do the same to each of them," he continued in the same dull monotone. "If the rest of my unit weren't here, and I left, you'd be alone, with 4 of your friends trying to hold their innards in. 4 of your friends crying to you for help, begging you to let them die." The medic turned back to look at him, and Ken saw a single tear in the corner of his right eye. "If I did that to you, and you had to choose whether you had to try to save their lives and watch them continue to shriek in agony, or to blow their brains out onto the desert sand to make that screaming stop, you would crawl back inside your turtle shell, and you would never want to come back out," he had intoned solemnly. Ken had said nothing. He wanted to apologize, to assuage his guilt over his insensitive comment, to be let off the hook. But the look on the medic's face told him no apology would be accepted. He had earned this hook. Over the course of the deployment, he had seen several situations not all that different from the one the medic had described. Men whose flesh had been sliced to ribbons by shrapnel flung from improvised explosive devices. He had heard sounds of screaming that he knew would never leave his memory. And over time, he came to understand that the men in the unit to which he had been assigned were exposed to greater danger because of his presence. That, as troops were moved, command was trying to protect him, because the enemy would consider capturing a reporter a great propaganda victory. The men taking this additional risk were doing so not because they held him, or even journalism in general, in high esteem, but because those were their orders. And he saw that shell-shocked look in his own eyes, in his reflection, and determined that if they could press on, so would he. If he had but known it, his own crew believed he had gone insane, because when orders were given, he did everything but shout, "Sir, yes, sir!" He had been desperate to do everything he could to make sure it wasn't any error he or his team made that cost anyone their lives. The day before he returned to the States, he sought out that medic again. The man had also survived their tour. Ken had thought long on this meeting, trying to come up with the right words, and couldn't find them. So he had saluted him. "You don't have to salute me," the medic said warily. "I'm a working man." "Beyond a recognition of rank, I'm told a salute can also be an expression of respect," Ken answered him, unwavering. The medic looked at him calmly, but said nothing. "I once said something very foolish to you. I know better now. Thank you," Ken had told him. "Then tell them back home," the medic replied quietly, at ease. "I will," Ken replied, and dropped his salute. Ken had tried hard to live up to that statement over the years, but as time had worn on, he found himself looking in the mirror, and the turtle he saw there wanted less and less to do with the vicious truths of life that real journalism demanded of him, and more he sought greener pastures, more comfortable positions, more time at home. Until Razorfall, he had managed to quiet the protests of his younger self and just coast. And yet here, staring at him across the bank of lights and indicators, and across a heap of years, how many? He could no longer precisely say, stared a face that could have been any one of the scores he saw in the Gulf, with that same expression. The look that said, "I have seen things I desperately need to forget, but first you must tell them. You must honor your promise." And so he would try. He thumbed the switch that stopped the playback of the interview with the old colonel, and waited for the light which indicated Tony had patched in the live feed. "This is Ken Sharkey at 850 KOA in Denver, the voice of America, and we interrupt this pre-recorded interview to bring you a live special report on the battle which has taken place on the western slope, at the place where the Razor cuts across Interstate 70. I have with me, here in the studio, Gerald Whitsitt, one of our men in uniform, with a first-hand account of the events which have been unfolding outside of Rifle. Gerald, start by telling us a little about yourself, and then tell us what you saw." "Well, sir, I'm a mechanic in the 4th Infantry Division, 3rd Armored Brigade. I work on vehicles mostly. You know, fix mechanical systems in tanks, APCs, stuff like that. Prior to this," he paused, with a gesture around him that seemed to mean everything in general, without being consciously aware that the audience couldn't see him. Mark had been the last who knew the video systems, so they had lost video capability when he departed with his brother for parts unknown. "I was stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. The work I do isn't on the high-tech components. Most computers and things are useless now anyway. I fix low-tech stuff, transmissions, gearboxes, engines. If it has moving parts and it breaks, my group will be the ones who fix it. After the event that everyone is calling Razorfall, there was a huge effort to retrofit many of the non-functional systems wherever possible, but that's not really my department," Gerald said, trailing off. "And you were assigned as support personnel for the armored vehicles as they made their way to Rifle?" Ken prompted him. "Yeah. Some personnel were flown in. The Air Force seized control of the county airport there to use as a staging area. But I rode along with a convoy carrying the vehicles from Fort Carson. It was really great seeing all those people lined up along the highway. I kind of felt like, well, it's silly, but there's this scene in the original Ghostbusters movie where the Ghostbusters are headed to where all the bad stuff is going down, and like the whole city is out on the streets, shouting and cheering in support. And they go in there and take care of business, and they come back out and everybody just goes nuts. Because even though things were touch and go for a bit, they pulled through, just like everybody thought they would. That's how it felt to me, riding past all those cheering people. We were going to go kick ass, these cat people or whatever, make them pay for screwing with us, and then everything would be back to normal and we'd be heroes. Gerald stopped. He chewed on the inside of his bottom lip. Ken had looked into his eyes. Even though the kid was looking down, he knew what was there to be seen. He waited. But that's not what happened. When we got to the staging area, it seemed like everybody felt like I did. Everyone was pumped up for a blowout. And then we assembled into column and advanced on the Razor. The kid's face was working as he tried to hold it together, as the minecart of his memory wheeled past the images he had seen without any way to change direction or speed. The enemy was occupying an open area after a bend in the interstate, not more than a mile from the Razor itself. That's what someone said, anyway. My team was in one of the support personnel carriers at the rear, so we didn't get close enough to verify that. I could see it, though. I could see where clouds that were coming out of it were making their own reflections. He shifted his gaze and looked directly at Ken. We all heard the broadcast, of course. Down at Fort Carson, every working radio was tuned in. I don't know if anyone was getting the TV signal or not, but we heard the audio. We were expecting 1,000 killing machines. Of course, in the old days, we'd have had SATCOM confirmation before we even left the base. If the Air Force had done any recon flybys, we weren't told about it. So when we saw that there were only around 100 of those things, a lot of guys started laughing. We thought it was going to be a cakewalk. Were you close enough to see them? To see what they actually looked like? Ken pressed him. Not at first. At first, from where we were, they just looked like oversized people in weird costumes walking around. They didn't seem to be really doing anything, just walking around. They looked bored. They weren't even paying attention to us the whole time we moved into position and formed up into formation. From where I was sitting, it was like the whole valley floor in front of us was crawling with army green. And in front of that, a bunch of weird-looking, tall cosplayers wandering back and forth. Even though your guy overestimated their numbers, he had it right as far as what they looked like. My old man was a collector of old cartoons. He had tons of videotapes. I used to love watching all those old Japanese mech anime shows. Robotech, Gundam Wing, even Voltron. It seems like the suits were always much larger than the pilots in the cartoons. But these cats really were only about 15 feet tall. With the cat-shaped heads, though, it was Voltron that they reminded me of most. All black with glowing blue eyes. But the lions in the old Voltron cartoons ran on all fours like real cats until they joined up to form the big guy. These stood upright all along, and they never joined together. He paused, looking down into his hands again. They never needed to. After a moment, he went on. Brass had somebody up front in an Abrams outfitted with a PA system. They started talking, and the catbots stopped briefly, but then went right back to what they were doing. Our guy kept on shouting, getting louder and louder, talking about this being an act of aggression, and if they wanted to avoid a direct confrontation, they should turn off the Razor. At least, that's what it sounded like to me. They were talking about powering down some kind of field or something. When the catbots didn't respond to any of that, our guy warned them that continued defiance would regrettably result in an armed response with maximum prejudice or something to that effect. He gave them a count of 10, counting down. I think a lot of us just figured they didn't understand English, and that the brass was just going through the motions before scragging them. When our guy shouted 3, the catbot closest to the front of the formation turned and walked toward us. It was hard to tell distance at that point, but it seemed like it was about 6 times its own height away from the front of the line, so like 90 feet, I guess. We were at the back, as I said, maybe 800 feet away from this cat. There was this humming sound, and then it shouted back at us. It shouted back? Ken asked incredulously. Yeah. It shouted 3 at us. Only our guy from top brass sounded like you'd expect from 800 feet away. From where we were, we could hear him, but it was about as loud as the guy in the drive-thru talking to the car in front of you. Presumably the PA was pointed in that direction, so that was a factor too. But the cat, he paused for emphasis, was unbelievably loud. Even as far away as we were, it felt like my teeth were vibrating in my jaw when it spoke. There was a blast. At first, I thought it had fired a weapon. But then I realized that it had, in a way. We have sound weapons too, but nothing like this. The sand and dirt all around the front of our formation had blasted up and backward with the force of that shout, making it look like a small mortar had hit the ground. My ears were filled with a faint tonal humming in response. What happened next? Ken inquired eagerly. There was a long pause, Gerald continued, and then our guy shouted, 2! It sounded like they had turned their amp up as high as it would go. It was still pathetic by comparison. And then 2 more of the other cats walked over and stood to either side of the first one. There was the humming again, like before, and all of the other cats stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. And then the 3 cats standing together shouted, 2! back at us. It was deafening. My eyeballs vibrated in their sockets. I instinctively shut my eyes, so I don't know what the sound blast looked like. I stuck my fingers in my ears, trying to dampen the sound or block it out, but it didn't seem to do anything. The sound pummeled my head, and then it was gone. When I pulled my fingers out of my ears, I half expected to see blood on the tips of them. Because the pain had been so bad, I thought for sure it must have busted my eardrums. I couldn't hear anything at first, not even ringing. I can't imagine how bad it must have been right up front. The Abrams main gun is a 120mm smoothbore cannon. Apparently, the brass decided this sonic attack was sufficient provocation to abort the countdown and attack. The Abrams fired, and that was when I saw the strangest thing I've ever seen. Gerald stopped and thought for a moment. It's hard to put this into terms the average person can comprehend. Imagine you had a gun so big that the cartridges you loaded into it were the size of a mannequin's leg. Each bullet, the part that leaves the gun headed towards your target, weighs roughly 20 pounds and leaves the barrel at nearly 3,800 miles per hour. There are different types of cartridges for different targets, but that's the level of energy we're talking about here. The cat didn't move. It didn't even twitch. It just stood there, and right after the report I should have been able to hear if my ears were working at that moment, there was a huge plume of debris that sprayed out from a rock wall on the south side of the interstate. You have to understand, there's no substance or force we know of that can turn a projectile with energy of that magnitude. And yet there it was. It bounced that round away like a child's toy with not so much as a scratch. Well, whether the cats understood the words they were shouting back at us or not, they understood this, and they were not happy about it. The first cat, which had been the target of the lead Abrams main gun, leaped into the air. It happened very fast, so it's hard for me to estimate the distances, but it had to have been a couple 100 feet. And then it came down like a bomb. The lead Abrams was flattened. I don't mean that it was crushed, like in a car crusher, which wouldn't be able to do much to an Abrams anyway. I mean that it became as thick as a picture of a tank on a piece of cardboard. The armored vehicles closest to the leader were blasted away from it by the shockwave, tumbling end over end. The other cats were all interested now, and some of them began pouring some form of heat energy from their fists or paws or whatever. Tanks started melting, with the ammo inside them making little explosions as they ignited from the heat. I still couldn't hear anything. although a faint ringing hum was beginning in my ears. But I could see the face of the driver of our APC. It looked to me like he said, "Shit, we are dead." An APC has no main gun, just small arms fire. Even against normal human tanks, an APC is little more than an expensive coffin. And then we were turning around, trying to retreat, trying to flee. Except there was nowhere to run. Through the slots in the armor on the rear of the carrier, we could see flashes of light and shadows in motion as vehicles were hurled through the air like balsa wood in the path of a hurricane. The carrier tumbled forward, and I saw the daylight and darkness of the ground alternate in front of the windshield as we rolled end over end. We came to rest right side up, or I don't think any of us would have been able to get out in time. Through the ringing in my ears, I could dimly hear the shouts of my team now, everyone clamoring to get out, and suddenly the doors were popping open and everyone was grabbing rifles from the storage compartments, and I just sat there watching in amazement. What did they think would happen to them? Did they think an M16 was going to dent a mech that could turn around from a 120mm cannon? I didn't even bother with trying to grab a weapon. I just got out of my harness and climbed out. All of my teammates were running toward another vehicle, with little flashes of light sputtering out of the muzzles of their rifles. I saw a cat turn toward them, and suddenly all of them, the men, the rifles, the vehicle, they all blazed into a light that was too bright to look at. I turned and ran. I ran until I felt like my lungs would explode, and then I ran some more. When I collapsed, I fell into a flood trench, a channel where rain had carved out a path during some flash flood in the past. I lay there, and as my hearing fully returned, I listened to the booming sounds of heavy, stomping footsteps, punctuated by increasingly sporadic small arms fire, as the cats hunted down and exterminated the rest of the men fleeing on foot. I laid there and waited for them to find me and kill me. I awoke long after dark. Everything was silent. I thought about going back to the staging area, but surely the cats would have figured out where the column had come from and followed their back trail and killed everyone there. I climbed out of the trench and made my way into the hills northeast of my position. I skirted around the town of Rifle proper and continued east. I stayed close to the track of the flood ditch in case I needed to jump in it to hide. Somewhere east of Rifle, I came across an old Subaru that had been abandoned, apparently due to a flat tire. I hotwired it and made my way to Newcastle, the next town east of Rifle. I have been on the move for the past 2 days, sticking to the back roads, occasionally going off-road to avoid checkpoints. The Army is setting these up at junctions of major routes. I had to acquire another vehicle when the Subaru expired after shearing a CV joint in a ditch on one of these off-road detours. But I grew up in Steamboat Springs, and the surrounding counties were my playground until I joined up with Uncle Sam. Once I got up into the higher elevations, I knew many of the seldom-used national park trails and made better progress. I came here to tell you this because the people need to know. Fighting these things is suicide. I don't know what's going to become of us, but the only way there will be anything left of America is if we surrender. We haven't got a chance in hell of fighting this. I think they could have found me sleeping in my ditch. I think the only reason they didn't bother to do so is that I didn't have a gun. You have to get the message out that Gerald was interrupted by the rattle of short bursts of automatic weapons fire. Everyone in the small broadcast studio looked toward the sound, in time to watch the door kicked inward. It bounced off the wall hard enough to dislodge the little pane of glass in its upper middle, which fell out and shattered on the floor. Soldiers in army gear advanced into the room. Behind them strode a tall officer with a bullhorn. "This station is under martial law," he bellowed through the bullhorn, before seemingly realizing that the device was slightly overkill for the small studio. He switched it off and began again. "This station is under martial law," he announced. "Cease and desist your broadcast immediately under pain of death." Ken's hands were in the air, but only his hands were surrendering. "This broadcast is a news radio station operating under the protection of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, and my guest," he began. "You were under the protection of the Constitution. That provision is superseded by the provisions of the Continuity of Government and Emergency Powers Acts, which empower the President to seize assets relating to communications in the event of an ongoing state of emergency, where exigent circumstances constitute a credible threat to the survival of the Republic. We are at war, Mr. Sharkey, and as such your broadcast facility is now under the direct control of the Department of Defense until such time as the threat has been eliminated. As for your guest," the officer sneered, "Private Gerald Whitsett is a deserter and a traitor. I hereby find him guilty of these charges and pronounce sentence," he said, and leveled a Colt .45 pistol through the window of the broadcast booth at Gerald's head. "Do you have any last words, Private?" Gerald lowered first his hands, then his head. "God help us all," he said, and this was followed by the deafening crash of the .45 in the confined space. The opposing wall of the booth was spattered crimson around the small exit hole the bullet had made as it continued on its way. Gerald Whitsett crumpled to the floor. In the 2 months after that event, Ken Sharkey had put his time as an embedded reporter to the best possible use he could. He had been instructed to only read from provided copy on all subjects related to the invasion, the war effort, military actions and movements, and the ever-increasing Army stranglehold over the community in general, as they continually inflated their demands for supplies, resources, accommodations, and, if rumor was correct, conscripts. Behavior unfitting to an officer had apparently been thrown out as an ethical standard as well, as the occupying force took it upon themselves to conscript entertainment personnel, both male and female, for the stated purpose of troop stress reduction. KOA's broadcast was little more than a mouthpiece for the occupying Army force, led by the tall, dark-haired officer who refused to identify himself by name. When pressed on the matter by anyone, his response was always the same. "To you, I am the general. You will address me as general. Beyond that, you do not have the need to know." Anyone who asked again was shot. Ken had tried every trick in the book. He tried flattery. He tried willfully misinterpreting the general's orders with his underlings. He tried bribery and other inducements as well. The best he was able to manage were occasional rambling Aesop's fables of his own creation, presented as culture and entertainment when official communiques were not scheduled. These invariably came as attempts to conjure up images and concepts intended to stir the passions of the populace, but the public were too busy struggling to survive at that point to offer much in the way of resistance to a supposedly legally sanctioned arm of the government. Instead of the savior the people had envisioned back when they had gathered along the parade route of the interstate months before, government had arrived and set itself up as a master and made slaves of its people. Then, one cold winter day, Ken became profoundly agitated. He paced back and forth in the studio, ranting unintelligibly to himself. Finally, he had locked himself in the broadcast booth and began ranting. He was still speaking in these vague terms when the general entered the studio. Ken looked around nervously, but pressed on, working himself to whatever it was that had upset him. He went on about the slippery slope of censorship, while the general took aim at first one body part, then another, smiling all the while. It was as if he couldn't decide which part he wanted to shoot off first, Tony thought. Tony had never left, despite the mounting pressures. In a way, he thought of Ken like a father figure now, and refused to abandon him. Perhaps in this way he had hoped to atone for what he had done to Vince. We may never know. Tony had picked up a pistol of his own many years ago, with a mind toward home defense. It was a pathetic, plastic little thing, a Taurus PT-738. He had never even shot it once, but he had read the manual and kept it cleaned and oiled. And after Gerald's death, he began to carry it with him at all times. It fit easily in his front pocket, and when he had originally bought it, he had gotten a pocket holster for it which made the outline of it there look like a wallet. As Tony watched the general targeting Ken's body parts, one after another, he began to grip the Taurus in his pocket. Maybe today was the day. Perhaps this was the time to make a stand. None of the general's men were in the studio at the moment. It was just the three of them. It was as he stood there, contemplating this, that Tony noticed one of the big indicator lamps go dark. The power to the main transmitter had been turned off. Whatever Ken was building up to, no one was going to hear him say it. And suddenly, in that moment, he saw his place in the grand scheme of things. It appeared in his mind, shining like a crystal-clear, glittering jewel. And with it, he imagined he heard Vince's voice. "You got one chance, man. Head or tail, you can still win this. You can win this." Mark might have been their video guru, and Vince might have been the resident master of the audio systems, but nobody knew the power systems like Tony. He knew this place like the back of his own beloved hands. He stepped over 5 feet to the right, where he was, coincidentally, directly behind the general. He pulled the tiny pistol out of his pocket and pointed it unsteadily at the general's back. His hand shook as he tried unsuccessfully to steady his aim. Finally, satisfied that he could do no better, he squeezed the trigger. He had done everything right enough, to the best of his ability. He hadn't tried to say something witty or tough, and thus given away his position. Unfortunately, his unfamiliarity with, and total disuse of, the weapon had caused him to be unaware that the pin which secured the autoloader slide was damaged. Instead of discharging, the slide and barrel assembly launched forward together, falling and clattering across the floor with the live round still unfired in the chamber. The general turned to look at the sound, and then at the cowardly technician who had found his spine just a little too late. "You were going to backshoot me? Naughty, naughty. No quick, clean death for you. Enjoy a gut shot, Mr. Ramirez," he said calmly, before shooting Tony in the stomach. Tony slumped to the floor, clutching his gut as the panel behind him sparked and sizzled. The general kicked the slide assembly off into the shadows and made a mock intake of pained breath in fake sympathy. "That's gotta hurt," he taunted, before turning his attention back to Ken, who was now screaming with rage. "You bastard! You know why I've locked myself in here? Because I know your dirty little secret, Herr General. I have it from a very reliable source that your friends in this idiot government have managed to retrofit the guidance system for a nuke and have launched it." The general stared at him blandly, smiling. "Do you have any idea what madness you have invoked? Do you imagine that there are not others on the other side of the razor who will notice their compatriots have ceased to phone home? Do you have any conception of the scale, the magnitude of the retribution they will rain down upon us? My fellow Americans, hear me now. The only hope any of us has now is to throw down our arms and cast ourselves upon the mercy of these invaders. If they are as advanced as they seem, there is a chance that in their mercy some remnant of the human race may survive. It is a feeble chance, but it is all we have. Americans, you absolutely must overthrow this tyrannical usurper and his thuggish goons if your children are to have any hope of a future." The general was laughing merrily. He began to clap slowly and continued to laugh. "What is so goddamn funny?" Ken shrieked, on the verge of hysteria. "You!" the general chuckled. "That was quite a performance. And yes, it's all true. We have nuked the cat freaks. And if more come, there are more nukes where that one came from. We will win this war, and no one will stand in the way of this legitimate government action. And do you know why? Ken stared at him in uncomprehending disbelief. Because your precious transmitter was turned off several minutes ago. No one has heard your inane rant, and no one ever will, Mr. Sharkey, he said, leveling the Colt at Ken's head. Goodbye. Actually, Tony moaned from the heap in which he lay on the floor, everyone heard it. What? The general roared, whirling. What did you say? Everyone heard the broadcast. They didn't hear you shoot me after I saw the power indicator for the main output relay go out. But this panel behind me? He tapped weakly at the base of the steel plate, where his own blood trickled slowly down. This is the switching system for the main output transformer, which your unnecessarily large bullet destroyed after perforating me. Pursuant to laws passed in 1963, known as the Emergency Broadcast System, which was also implemented as a safeguard against a grave national crisis, in the event of a system failure of main output power, the active transmitter is automatically switched over to backup power. By shooting me, you turned the broadcast back on. Tony laughed. The sound was painful to hear, and sounded like he was talking through a tube half filled with water. No! You fool! You'll ruin everything! The general bellowed, and began shooting Tony repeatedly. The jumbled heap twitched spasmodically as the slugs tore through him, but Tony made no further sound. And soon the only thing that could be heard was the general grunting as he fruitlessly pulled the trigger of his empty weapon. From behind him, and now filled with a calm resolve the general had not heard before, Ken spoke. I have always been the most vocal in my support for the First Amendment freedoms protected by my Constitution. But in recent days, I have been forced to admit that I was wrong to shun the rights secured by the Second, for it seems that the rights enumerated in the Second are needed to guarantee those in the First. The 9mm that had appeared in Ken's hand barked its sharp, flat crack twice, and the general fell dead. In the days which followed, no one could be found who would admit to knowing the dead man's actual name, nor would anyone posthumously corroborate his claimed rank, so he was buried in an unmarked grave. Sadly, whatever motives the cats had for staying in the vicinity of their incursion point, the nuclear attack had apparently erased or outweighed it, and soon cats began to appear in all of the once grand cities of the United States east of the Rockies, except Denver. Always they arrived in pairs. Men were not harmed if they made no effort to fight or resist or smuggle women out of the perimeters the cats quickly set up upon arrival, for women were not permitted to leave, whereas men were inexorably driven out. News of the capture of cities was gradually spread by men who escaped. Within 18 months of the nuclear strike against the cats, every major American city east of the Razor, save Denver, had been visited by the conquerors. It was not long after, perhaps 2 years since the date of the attack, that word began to come in, slowly at first but with increasing frequency. The cats were leaving. These reports came from men who had left women behind, wives, mothers, daughters. They returned in secret, hoping against hope to spirit away the captives, heedless of the risk. Yet in every city the cats had abandoned, there was no one. There were no mass graves, no heaped corpses, and yet every single person was gone, leaving the cities as derelict ghost metropoles, returned once more to the dominion of the rats and roaches. None of the women had been seen since. End of part 5.